Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a Ukraine war news update, the second part thereof for today, the 10th of June 2025. And actually, this is a geopolitical news update where I haven't done one for actually quite a few days. Just there's been so much breaking news and individual bits and pieces coming out. But this is one concerning everything about the war in Ukraine and the ripples that spread out across the world. We're going to start with Germany first. And of course, we know that Friedrich Merz went to the White House, to the Oval Office, and met with Trump. Really interesting. I saw the handshake. You know, Trump tries to take advantage of people with weird, strong handshakes. And you see this handshake competition between him and Emmanuel Macron very often, where they have this really long, weird handshake ritual. Well, Merz did the handshake, and what Trump often tries to do is take your hand towards you, and so it's like in his sphere of personal space, and then he's controlling your hand, if you like, with him. And they had this bit of a tussle, and actually Merz pulled it back, and it was just quite interesting that Merz has obviously keyed into what would likely happen and was ready. And yeah, interesting handshake. Anyway, Trump offered Germany US gas deals, but no promises on Ukraine aid or Russia sanctions. In other words, Merz going to the US really didn't achieve anything with regard to Ukraine. When asked if he would impose additional sanctions on Russia, says Kyiv Independent, Trump dodged the question by boasting that he, quote, ended Nord Stream 2 and hinting a future energy deal with Germany. Some US lawmakers said, Merz here reported in Reuters, do not understand the scale of Russia's rearmament campaign. Quote, I met with some senators on Capitol Hill and told them to please look at the rearmament Russia is doing, Merz told a business conference in Berlin. So yeah, the headline is Germany's Merz says some US lawmakers have no idea of the scale of Russia's rearmament. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz told Fox News that had Ukraine been accepted into NATO back in 2008, today's war might have been avoided. He added, "The only strength brings peace." Quote, "If you are weak, you invite aggression. That is why we support Ukraine as long as necessary." This idea that the war started because there is this creeping NATO expansionism taking place is ridiculous. It's actually the opposite of that. Because Ukraine were not allowed into NATO, that has given Russia the impetus to invade Ukraine. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done. Now, Spravdi reports, Stratcom Center, Germany finally is to begin countering the blitz of Russian disinformational attacks. German MP Roderick Kiesewetter has called for urgent measures to counter rising Russian cyber attacks and sabotage attempts. Among his proposals, expel remaining Russian agents and diplomats, shut down Russian-linked institutions, including the Russia House in Berlin, operated by Russotrudnichestvo, already under EU sanctions since 2022, restrict visas and ban propaganda events or speakers, block Kremlin propaganda portals in Germany. I think all this should have been done ages ago. This is all very sensible. They need to just get really hard on Russia, full stop, culturally, economically, everything. Kiesewetter also proposed launching a disinformation alert app similar to the Nina emergency system to warn citizens of Russian disinformation operations in real time. He advocates creating a dedicated agency to detect and counter disinformation using hybrid methods, an institutional response to Russia's systematic attempts to destabilize Europe from within. I think that is a brilliant idea. I think all of that, I think we need to be so active in countering disinformation. It's honestly one of the biggest threats to our existence at the moment. You know, in terms of more abstract threats, I guess, you know, we can talk about climate change and we can talk about like the war itself. But as we're sitting in countries that where the realization of these things either is too far away or feels too far away, both in geography and time, we can be affected very much daily by disinformation. We are consuming so much information online on a daily basis. We need tools and policies and real tangible efforts to counter disinformation. Every nation does. I think this is one of the most important things we need to be dealing with at the moment. Lithuania's President Nausėda has criticised German Chancellor Merz for failing to follow through on promised sanctions against Russia after it ignored a ceasefire ultimatum. I think the idea was he was going to go to the US, garner some support from the US, and together the EU and the US would put sanctions on Russia, but it kind of failed. Now, there is an 18th package that we're going to talk about in a wee while. The 18th sanctions package from the EU already seems to be becoming finalised. Anyway, Nausėda said this undermines trust not just in sanctions but in all support for Ukraine. Nausėda told Bild, urging tougher EU action. And then, oh no, that was the wrong one. So this is it. Anton Gerashchenko reporting that drones are increasingly being spotted off the coast of Germany and near military facilities. Western intelligence services suspect Russia, according to a new investigation by German media companies WDR and NDR and Süddeutsche Zeitung, the SZ newspaper. The investigation mentions in particular the case of the cargo ship HAV Dolphin, which immediately after repairs in Kaliningrad spent more than 8 days at anchor in the Bay of Kiel, where the Germany's first flotilla is stationed. When drones were spotted near the naval base, the German authorities decided to inspect the Dolphin ship. According to journalists, the federal police did not find any drones there, but established that the entire crew of 7 consisted of Russian citizens. According to NDR, WDR and SZ, the total number of drone sightings along the entire German coastline has been as high as 100. European security services agree that at least some of these drones are launched from civilian ships belonging to Russia's shadow fleet. Also, the Russian intelligence services have released, I think I've got that coming later, something to do with NATO essentially being toothless, really, and they're not really bothered about NATO Article 5 anymore. And that's coming from the German intelligence services. But we'll come on to that a little bit later. Right, now we're going to go to Hungary and then Slovakia. Now, Hungary, wow. So lots of people are saying Viktor Orban seems to have done a complete about turn on Russia. I don't think so at all. But there is this element of playing both sides. And this could be because the EU is putting really big pressure on Hungary in terms of funding. Could also be that he's reading the polls and that Ukraine is far more supported within the Hungarian population, and particularly the growing support of the opposition party under Peter Magyar. They are particularly strong on supporting Ukraine because they're obviously adopting different positions to Orban. Orban is not polling particularly well at the moment, and he could be reacting to that. But either way, he's been interviewed by a French channel recently, and he said some fairly extraordinary things. Let's have a look at this. I will read out the subtitles. I believe, he says, that force is the only language the Russians understand, and Europe must be strong. We need to negotiate from a position of strength. Unfortunately, right now we are weak. That's why we need the Americans, but Europe must become stronger in the long term. There must be a strategic agreement with Russia, but only a strong Europe will be able to achieve that. I mean, it's completely opposite to what Orban would otherwise have said. I mean, there's nothing really to disagree with there. As someone says, Orban, is that a joke? Did someone assassinate the PM and replace him with a body double? Is he drunk? But I would just be very wary of Orban. Indeed, Anton Gerashchenko has another video. Judging by the statements of Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, says Gerashchenko, regarding Russia's weakness and his mention of President Trump's peace initiatives, it's a possibility that the US leadership might soon adopt a tougher stance in negotiations with Putin concerning peace. During an interview with French LCI channel, PM Orban said that he sees no risk of a war in Europe because, quote, the Russians are too weak for that. They aren't even capable of defeating Ukraine, so they are incapable of truly attacking NATO. Wow, again, let's just get a sense of what he says there. So the bombings in Russia, in Ukraine, do you see a risk of general war in Europe? The interviewer asks. No. Why? Because the Russians are too weak for that. They're not even capable of defeating Ukraine, and so they're in no position to truly attack NATO. So yeah, exactly what he said. Absolutely right. I actually agree with this. Some people think Russia will just go on after Ukraine to two other nations further to the west, but I don't think there'd been a place to be able to do that unless they really picked up Ukrainian people, and that would require Ukraine to completely capitulate and Russia to take the entirety of Ukraine. But I think Ukraine is doing a pretty amazing job of attriting the Russian forces and degrading their capacity and capability right across a number of different domains. So, yeah, I'm slightly unsure of that, and I actually think Orban again is correct there. That is wholly weird, isn't it? Trent Telenko says, I seriously wonder what Hungarian intelligence is telling President Orban about the Russian wartime economy. Russia having 213% potato price inflation after a crop failure tells me Russia has no spare foreign exchange to buy replacement foreign potatoes. That has implications. Well, the issues for Russia right across the board could be leading Orban to start reading the tea leaves about Russia. This could be an indication that Russia's economy is particularly precarious. And he's starting to go, Europe has deeper pockets than Russia, is in a better position. Let's side with Europe against Russia going forward. I wouldn't blame him. I think that's almost certainly true. How long can Russia keep this going? I don't know. But every month that Russia keeps this war going, their reserves are being absolutely, destroyed. The currency reserves, their gold reserves, their wealth funds, and so on and so forth. Every month hurts Russia more and more. Yes, Ukraine is of course hurting, but Ukraine has a lot of very explicit financial, economic, trade, military assistance from all sorts of different nations to in a way that Russia doesn't. Yes, there's China, and then you've got sort of Iran and North Korea, but realistically, Russia are I think in trouble, and could be that Orban realizes that, or it could be because in that interview he also goes on to say that, for example, I think he says Putin is welcome to Budapest anytime and he'll be treated absolutely, he fawns over Putin still. So this isn't like going against Russia, but I think there's maybe an element of realism there. Now, interestingly, Zelensky has just been interviewed by, I think, the last remaining liberal or non-government influence media organization in Hungary, and it's I think quite an impactful interview. A number of things mentioned. I'm just going to talk about a couple of things. Orban uses my face and Ukraine's situation in his political campaign without permission. I did not authorize this, he said. He's also noted, so this is a poster campaign, for example, talking about how Hungarians should have their own future in their own hands, not these people. So Zelensky and Ursula von der Leyen and so on and so forth shouldn't be dictating the future of Hungary. I didn't authorize this, he said. He notes that Hungarian agents recently sought locations of air defense systems and military units in border regions. So remember when they arrested a couple of Hungarians in Transcarpathia, the Carpathian Mountains near Zakopatia. And then that led to the Hungarians arresting a couple of former diplomats or something in Hungary, and then a couple more, I think, a few days later, and it became a bit of a political spat. Well, he was saying originally these Hungarians were seeking the locations of air defense systems and military units in the border regions while gauging Transcarpathian residents' views on Hungarian peacekeepers. So that's all rather controversial. But so that interview has also been causing a few ripples, both Orban's and Zelensky's. Now, Slovakia is in the news. The Slovakian parliament urged the government to oppose new Russian sanctions. The resolution argues that sanctions imposed on Russia have driven up energy prices, disrupted supply chains, and harmed Slovak industry. Slovakia's parliament has officially allowed Fico to opt out of supporting sanctions against Russia. The proposal, backed by a pro-Russian coalition party, passed with 51 out of the 76 votes. Despite the anti-sanctions rhetoric, Fico has so far supported all EU sanctions packages against Moscow. More on that in a second. Slovakia will block any EU sanctions against Russia if they infringe on the country's interests, says PM Fico. So he might be kind of supporting them, but if they go, he's giving himself elbow room not to support them, I guess. Now, let's go to that then. So the 18th package of sanctions against Russia from the EU proposes the imposition of restrictions on 9 individuals and 33 legal entities, according to Radio Liberty. As noted, the new package of sanctions, says Max 25, is aimed at Russia's energy revenues and its military industry. Among other things, the EU proposes to include several companies that manage or provide for the operation of shadow fleet vessels, both Russian and from third countries, United Arab Emirates, Mauritius, Hong Kong. They plan to include the captain of the shadow fleet vessel under EU sanctions on the list. As the document states, the EU sanctions package proposes a reduction in the marginal price of oil from $60 to $45 per barrel, so that's huge, in order to reduce Russia's energy revenues. There's another one here from Max 25 referencing the Financial Times. The EU is to target Nord Stream and Russian oil production with new sanctions package. Again, oil price coming down from $60 to $45 per barrel. That's huge. As well as banning the use of Russian energy infrastructure, including 2 Nord Stream pipelines. So they're going to officially kind of close down the options on Nord Stream, which would then mean it would be very difficult or more difficult for the Americans to try and revitalize that, even though Trump keeps talking about how he was the one that stopped Nord Stream. Nord Stream was all about him. Isn't it wonderful that Nord Stream's been stopped? It's all about me. But then there seems to be moves to get Americans who would quite like that restarted, who have fingers in different energy pots, I guess. They've been over in Europe and sort of, I guess, testing the waters for potential resurrection of the Nord Stream pipelines to line their own pockets in some way. And so you kind of mixed messages going on there. The sources said that the proposal would also include a list of additional Russian banks and shadow fleet vessels. So that's going to come online soon. Hopefully it's going to be really harsh. This was the one that seemed to be touted as the kind of the response to Russia not agreeing to a ceasefire. So it's like, right, let's come down really heavily on them. If this is just another kind of incremental little push, then okay, better than nothing, but still doesn't quite live up to the threats that were coming from people like Merz and others concerning those sanctions. Now, only 40% of Russian capacity is under sanction, and the EU must step up, according to Lithuanian foreign minister, who says that the EU has more work to do in sanctioning Russia's economy. So there evidently is a lot of spare capacity for sanctions on Russia and places that the EU can go. Now, Western firms have reportedly paid at least $46 billion in taxes to Russia amid the full-scale war in Ukraine, paying that over the past 3 years, according to an investigation by Follow the Money. The question would be, how much has that gone down? I would like to know what the tax income from European nations was on average on a yearly basis, and then how significantly that has gone down, if at all, over the course of the war. Because I'm sure that though 46 billion sounds an awful lot, and it is way too much, and we need to definitely scale back on any economic activity with Russia. Like if that was like 150 billion before then that is a vast difference. So it's slightly lacking in context, that figure. So I'm not excusing it or whatever. I just I don't know, but still too high. Any money going to the Russian coffers is too high. Now, Sweden has suffered with some serious sabotage. The question is, who's doing this? Unknown persons damaged more than 30 communication towers in Sweden, and in all cases the attackers cut the cables and damaged important elements without stealing any equipment. So this is I think potentially quite a serious matter. If there are any Swedes watching, please give us the lowdown on what is going on in that neck of the woods in Sweden and who you think is responsible. Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania have demanded concrete NATO steps for Ukraine and set a 2030 deadline for Ukraine's EU membership. This is really good. The Baltics are very supportive of Ukraine, and demanding that there are concrete steps put in place by NATO is awesome, because that kind of goes against like the US and some other nations actually, and just I think it more formally establishes that there is definitely some considerable support within NATO for Ukraine's NATO accession. I think it's an absolute. You know, there's been a lot of rhetoric saying they are on an, an immovable, not immovable. There is absolutely no doubt that they will be joining NATO. That path is set in stone. But unfortunately, that kind of belief has ended in rhetoric rather than there being anything more concrete in place. So the Baltic nations here demanding something actually gets put in place. I mean, you remember 2 years ago we were talking about a map for accession to NATO, and even then, under sort of the Biden era, there was a consistent set of complaints that this is all rhetoric and there's no actual stepping stones being put in place. And here we are in 2025, and it's exactly the same scenario. So I think the Baltics there have got every right to make those kind of demands on behalf of Ukraine, obviously. Poland's President-elect Nawrocki has said he opposes Ukraine's accession to the EU at the moment. However, he recognises that we need to support Ukraine from a strategic and geopolitical point of view. So it's kind of like having his cake and eating it there. I believe, he says, that Ukraine is defending itself very bravely, but it also needs to respect other countries' interests, especially since they supported it from the very beginning. Russia is a post-imperialist, neo-communist state led by the war criminal Vladimir Putin, Nawrocki said. So we've got to remember that Nawrocki, while he is on the populist right, so he's a how far right you would place him is up for debate, but he's certainly a fairly considerably to the right populist politician, former football hooligan and whatnot, but he has always been. So he's also a historian. He was in charge of, what was the institute he was in charge of? Some kind of remembrance museum, where he was basically really anti, what Nazi Germany did in terms of Poland, but also Soviet Russia. And so he is anti-Soviet Russia. He's anti-Russian in the same way that Andrzej Duda and the PIS generally are anti-Russia, even though they sit on the populist right. And I say even though. The Law and Justice Party is slightly different, is different from the Confederation Party in Poland that really sits on the far right and is much more pro-Russian. PIS was anti-EU, like Eurosceptic, but supportive of Ukraine. So you've had a bipartisan support of Ukraine in Poland, because I think Poland has just a different relationship with Russia. Hungary is just bizarre, isn't it? What I think Viktor Orban and his party they're not bizarre. It's clear that they have had some serious pockets being lined by the Russians over time, and Orban's family being like billionaires and having grifted off Hungary. I think they've done that with the support of Russia, and they've just been kind of sucked into that Russian sphere of influence. But you could otherwise have a situation similar to Poland in Hungary, but they just haven't gone that direction. Right. Unfortunately, things are not looking good in Georgia. In Georgia, opposition leader, and I've not reported on Georgia for ages, which I think gives a reflection of how, I was saying that Euromaidan needs to be replicated in Georgia, where you had a permanent, really sizable protest going on that was kind of in camps rather than coming back every day and protesting. And unfortunately, I just think that the government could just play the long game there. I think that's probably what's happened. But I don't know enough at the moment. I've not been keeping an eye closely enough. Marika Mikiashvili, who I interviewed, says in Georgia, opposition leader's husband has been kidnapped, blindfolded, and threatened with his 3 children. I don't think that means he's been threatened with his children. I'm sure he gets on very well with them. So his 3 children have been threatened as well. UNM Georgia chair Tina Bokuchava's husband, Kote Yasiliani, was kidnapped, blindfolded, threatened, and the children threatened too. They demanded that Yasiliani publicly apologize to Uta Ivanishvili, the son of Bijina Ivanishvili. So Bijina Ivanishvili is the billionaire oligarch who started the Georgia Dream Party. He's no longer a politician, but he runs the country effectively, and he is very much in the Russian sphere of influence there. And his son, they're demanding that Yossiliani publicly apologized to Ivanishvili's son for his comments about Uta's sexual life made 8 years ago, and for which he already apologized in 2018. However, according to Tina Bokucheva, the real motive behind the Kadyrov-style intimidation is to frighten her. Tina Bokucheva is an unyielding, principled and resourceful leader, so opposition parties are being hounded, opposition politicians are being hounded, and their families, it seems. Okay, we're going to go to now what the German intelligence said. I really should have just included this in the German section. Russia is determined to test the resolve of the NATO alliance, says Anton Gerashenko, including by extending its confrontation with the West beyond the borders of Ukraine. The German Foreign Intelligence Chief Bruno Karl has told Table Media, and Reuters report Russia could send little green men to test NATO's resolve, according to the German intelligence boss warns. Head of the Federal Intelligence Service said his agency had clear intelligence indications that Russian officials believed the collective defence obligations enshrined in NATO treaty no longer had practical force. So you've got the German intelligence agency saying that Russia are not afraid of NATO anymore. Article 5 is essentially practically redundant as far as they see it, which is definitely a worry. It's hugely worrying. Yulia Severenko says Canada, so moving on to Canada now, comes through again, demonstrating once more what true partnership looks like. Ottawa has extended its duty-free import regime. And by the way, this is on the back of imports going back on, tariffs going back on Ukrainian goods going into the EU. So the EU have reinstituted tariffs on Ukrainian produce. Ottawa has extended its duty-free import regime for Ukrainian goods for another year, giving Ukrainian producers continued access to one of the world's most open and reliable markets. Thanks to this preferential regime introduced in 2022, Ukrainian imports to Canada have already surpassed $35 million, saving Canadian importers $8.5 million in duties. The extension means at least $1.2 million more in savings, while creating new opportunities for Ukrainian manufacturers and exporters to expand their presence in North America. In total, Ukraine's exports to Canada reached $152 million in 2024, a reflection on the growing commercial ties between the two countries. We are deeply grateful for this decision and for Canada's systemic support, military, energy, financial and diplomatic. Special thanks to so on and so forth. Canada stands with Ukraine not only in words but in lasting economic partnership. Okay, so that is good news that's the first Deputy Prime Minister of and Minister of Economy of Ukraine. Now, Canada, having said that, thanks very much for Canadian support and whatnot. Many people have been critical of Canada's expenditure on defense as far as NATO is concerned. They are huge underspenders, and in fact Donald Trump does have a point with regard to the Canadians sort of riding on America's coattails, the US's coattails there in terms of defense. And Mark Carney has said he's going to put that straight. Well, we hear that Canadian PM has vowed to boost defence spending and reduce dependency on the US, saying that they will hit the NATO target of 2% of GDP 5 years ahead of schedule amid a dangerous and divided world. So speaking at the University of Toronto on Monday, Mark Carney said Canada would reach NATO's 2% military expenditure target this fiscal year, 5 years ahead of a previously announced schedule. For years, Canada had been viewed as a defence loafer, and successive prime ministers have failed to bring the country's commitments in line with allies. A recent NATO report found that Canada spent an estimated 1.45% of its GDP on defence last year. The prime minister pledged to divert billions in spending to domestic manufacturers. So again, the way you do this is by using it as an economic stimulus package, because you are just having a trade war with your neighbours, the US. So this is a time where Canada has to show some sort of national spine economic spine, stand up to the United States, but do that obviously in a way that's supportive of your own industry. And as we've seen with the UK and other places, the defence expenditure is being used as a kind of Keynesian military spending and stimulus for the economy. So the Prime Minister has pledged to divert billions in spending to domestic manufacturers, warning his country had become too reliant on the United States for its defence capabilities. And there you go. So this is not only being used as a way to say to your electorate, hey, we're standing up to the United States, screw you, we're not going to buy stuff off you, and that will hurt the United States in terms of the trade war. But actually, it's also sensible for economic stimulation and security, really. So the more reliant you are on other countries for your own national security, the less independent you are and the less secure you are, essentially, because you are your security dependency is devolved. Okay, quote, only one of 4 submarines is seaworthy, said Carney. Less than half of our maritime fleet and land vehicles are operational. In the past, Canada turned to the United States to source its military hardware, but in his speech, the Prime Minister acknowledged that while the US had become Canada's closest ally and dominant trading partner, Donald Trump's protectionist tariffs and threats to Canadian sovereignty had cast a shadow over the future of that relationship. Now, the United States is beginning to monetize its hegemony, he says, charging for access to its markets and reducing its relative contributions to our collective security. Ahead of Canada's spring federal election, there was spirited debate in the country over whether to cancel a multi-billion-dollar order for US-built F-35 stealth fighters. Canada has committed to buy 16 of the jets from Lockheed Martin at a cost of nearly $85 million each, but revelations that the US would control all F-35 software updates and own all of the spare parts has once again revived arguments for diversifying procurement to more reliable allies. Quote, we will ensure every dollar is invested wisely, including by prioritising made in Canada manufacturing and supply chains, said Carney. We should no longer send 3/4 of our defence capital spending to America. That's why defence and industrial and economic strategies need to be integrated. That's why I've argued that there's no surprise that the EU is talking much more about defence, more and more and more. And that you're going to have conversations about an EU army because it's very difficult to kind of separate all of these elements of governance away from each other and just kind of look at one without concerning yourself with the other. So looking at your economic strategy and looking at your trade strategy without saying anything or considering your defense and strategy. It's just not going to work. Now, Mark Carney here yesterday, or within the last 24 hours, has said, quote from his own Twitter handle, we will invest in new submarines, aircraft, ships, armed vehicles, artillery, radar and drones, equipment that for too long Canada has let age and deteriorate, and will rebuild with Canadian steel, Canadian aluminium and Canadian workers. So this is a real kind of nationalistic drive, economic drive to fulfill the 2% expenditure criterion with while also seeming strong domestically to your electorate, standing up to the United States. Now, Ukraine hopes for a Trump-Zelensky meeting in Canada during the G7 meetings that are taking place there in just 5 days' time. Zelensky plans to meet the US president during the G7 summit in Alberta, according to Andriy Yermak, head of the presidential office. Yermak said the Ukrainian delegation's recent trip to Washington was aimed in part at arranging the high-level meeting between Zelensky and Trump. So Yermak went over straight after Istanbul failed effectively, went straight over to the United States. I think there was another Canadian talking to the Senate, giving information on stuff. So that seems to be the part of the rationale for Yermak going straight over to the US then was to put these things in place for that meeting at the G7. Now, Japan has bought 600,000 barrels of Russian oil using blacklisted tankers. a blacklisted tanker defying US and EU sanctions, according to a Bloomberg report. So that is really frustrating. Hopefully that will be sorted out going forward. Pekka Kalianiemi here says that this is with regard to Elon Musk here, and kind of our attention has been distracted because of the LA riots away from the fracas between Elon Musk and Donald Trump, and actually the huge issues there. And one of the things that was developing a day or so ago, actually, no, this is 3 days ago, isn't it? That's been lost in the in the LA riots news cycles, and that's why I'm absolutely confident that that was acting as a distraction, but also a way for Trump to sow division in the country, to create a problem that then he solves. So they didn't need to get the National Guard involved, and now Marines, 500 to 700 Marines. And by the way, they haven't blitted them, they haven't given them food and whatnot. It's just a really bizarre situation. Anyway, you got all these troops being sent, federalized troops being sent to LA when they didn't need it. Actually, you just had a few burning cars. You don't need troops. But what that does is whip up dissent and whip up a storm there that otherwise wouldn't have happened, and then it justifies those troops being there. It's like this cyclical thing, and then you have law and order stamping down on these criminals and these illegals and whatnot, and it looks like you have a very strong federal government, and it's these democratic states, these immigrant states, California and Gavin Newsom, they become the enemy, and you solve a problem that you yourself have created. And then you have, invariably, you're going to have looters, and which that's exactly what's happening. So, of course, if there are riots, then looters come along, and then the looters get associated with the protesters. So you're tarring the protesters with the looters' brush, and he's saying these protesters are just, bloody criminals and etc. Except those are two different things, and the looters are capitalizing on the chaos, and that's a chaos that the US government has helped to sow. So you get this whole situation's been manufactured. It's really interesting. Go and watch James O'Brien yesterday on LBC talking a lot about this, and getting quite a few American actually expats on talking about this, and how it's just manufactured. So it entirely in line with what I was saying in my video yesterday. And if you haven't watched it, please go and watch that American LA riots video that I did. I think it gives a really good account of that. But in amongst that, you had stories like this that just get lost. The White House security staff warned Musk's Starlink is a security risk. Starlink satellite connections in the White House bypass controls meant to stop leaks and hacking. Of course, remember, one of the main things that Mr. Doge wanted, Elon Musk wanted, was the data from the government. And that data can be plugged into AI and given to Palantir, Peter Thiel, his mate Peter Thiel. And then, that's what it was all about. Pekka Kalianiemi here saying, we can expect many articles critical of Elon Musk to come out from the White House in the near future. Time to restock my popcorn storage. However, I think, he's been let off the hook here. The Daily Beast reported Elon Musk's goons at Doge transmitted a large amount of data, all of it undetected, using a Starlink Wi-Fi terminal they installed on top of the White House, according to a new report, which is, highly, highly controversial. Right, going on to the US bill. Of course, we have heard already that the Richard Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham bill that's going to put these bone-crushing Russian sanctions onto Russia, and also secondary sanctions on nations dealing with Russian hydrocarbons and whatnot, that Trump wanted to water that down. The Wall Street Journal came out with an article talking about Trump wanting to water down that harsh bill, and that's completely unsurprising. The anti-Russia sanctions bill will undergo significant changes as it moves through Congress, and when consultations with the Trump team potentially taking considerable time, according to Politico. This is, I guess, to be expected, even though it's got 82 co-sponsors in the Senate. As it goes through Congress, so the House of Representatives and the Senate, they're going to be looking at, well, how much damage would that do to American trade and whatnot. And Bill Browder was saying that it wouldn't have any effect yesterday. He was saying, or was it this morning on Times Radio, saying that this should be done. It's an absolute no-brainer. It's not going to affect the Americans at all. But actually, there are arguments to say that it would exacerbate an already existing trade war, where you are going to start trying to whack on secondary sanctions onto nations dealing, like India and China, dealing with Russia, cheap Russian oil and whatnot. Then it could become a problem. Graham's bone-crushing Russia sanctions bill could freeze US trade with the world's largest economies. It says this Politico article: the proposed 500% tariffs on countries that buy Russian energy could cut the US off from major trade partners. So you can imagine that the Congress is going to have a really close look at that bill. Now, Finnish Prime Minister has criticised reported attempts by Trump to weaken the Russian sanctions bill. So the Finnish Prime Minister, that's Orpo, not Alexander Stubb, who's the president. Finnish Prime Minister Petteri Orpo on June the 7th criticised a weakened Russia sanctions bill amid reports that the US President Donald Trump is pressuring the Senate to weaken the legislation. So some very public criticism there, but I don't think that'd get through to those that matter in the United States. Pekka Kaliniemi says, keep in mind that, and this isn't just worth reminding ourselves of really what Trump has done or hasn't done in terms of, do you think Trump's the right person? Can he be the right person for Ukraine? Absolutely bloody not. Okay, what has taken place? Trump hasn't sent any military aid to Ukraine that wasn't first approved by the Biden administration. No aid has gone to Ukraine. He withheld intelligence and paused military aid at a critical time, apparently on the behest of, there are some rumours saying that was actually Pete Hegseth did that, and actually the White House didn't even know about some of that. But anyway, the Trump administration refused to call Russia the aggressor. Since Trump came to power, the US has eased sanctions on and weakened enforcement. Trump has called Zelensky a dictator. His administration approved anti-drone weapons from Ukraine. So those 70,000 missiles that were going to go, or fuses to the missiles that were going to go to Ukraine, now going to the Middle East. For a long time, Trump refused to sell air defense systems or even F-16 spare parts to Ukraine. He also tried to loot Ukraine through a shady minerals deal. Zelensky said no, and Trump has praised Putin and called him his friend. I mean, he's done all sorts of praising of Putin and all sorts of criticisms of Zelensky. Every time he has an opportunity to criticize Putin, he ends up criticizing Zelensky. Agent Krasnov is not a friend of Ukraine. And you could add to that list, of course, hugely. Now, Zelensky has said in public that he believes that Putin is winning the war, but that Trump, believes that Putin's winning the war, but that's not true. Quote, I know he said this to some people in his circle. I believe it doesn't reflect reality. It's not true. And I don't just mean his words, but the actual situation. It's not a victory when you lose 1 million people just to gain a few thousand kilometers, said Zelensky. Also, he has said this. Zelensky, I don't think this is in English. We are ready to accept every proposal in one form or another put forward by members of the Trump administration to both sides. We supported them all. Russia didn't support a single one. So who doesn't want to end the war? I think he's getting sick and tired of being bad-mouthed in public. That Zelensky's really difficult to deal with. Ukraine, that if he's going to put sanctions on Trump, he's going to put them on both, which is kind of weird. Zelensky's saying, look, we've done everything that we've been asked on. What has Putin done? What has Russia done to make any compromises or to do what the US is expected? They haven't done a single thing. So who doesn't want peace? Well, obviously the Russians don't want peace. Putin doesn't want peace. He's not in the least bit interested. Going back to Kaliniemi, what Trump is doing in the United States. So this is with regard to troops and Marines, National Guard and Marines and whatnot in LA, is the same as what Putin did in Russia in the early 2000s. Almost the same playbook with only slight differences. If this isn't challenged, the US could become a fully authoritarian state within the next 5 years. And lots of people are genuinely worried about that. Now, Trump then in public, just, goodness me, he says such weird things and things that might have elements of either interest or truth, but the way it's presented is deeply, I think, insulting and deeply narcissistic, either on a personal level or on a USA kind of level. So listen to him here. It's just wow.
I think important moment for this country. 2 weeks ago I was calling people and back and forth with leaders, including President Putin, including French president, including lots of different people. And all of them said, we're celebrating victory in World War II. And I said, wow, isn't that amazing? We're the only one that wasn't celebrating, and we're the one that won the war.
So this whole "we won the war," and I know many Americans like to think that, and of course causality is really bloody difficult to talk about. I wrote a book on this, broadly talking about, where are you? One of my books there. It is, no, it isn't. Anyway, I can't find it now. I am going to find that, god damn it. There it is. It's just there. It's behind my screen. Anyway, I wrote a book saying, did God create the universe from nothing? Countering William Lane Crane's Kalam cosmological argument, right? I don't want to get onto whether or not God exists or whatever, but part of this is to do with causality and how causality works, and whether it's really difficult to say someone's responsible for something, actually, because you can just keep taking causality back further and further, and then you're like, there are things that people didn't do that can be causally efficacious, and it's really, we simplify causality and say, well, you were the nearest thing to this event that had an impact on that. It's kind of a proximity bias, therefore you caused that, and blah blah blah. But it's so much more complicated. So when you look at World War II, like, how did World War II come to finish with the Nazis like losing or whatever? Then you can talk about the Americans getting involved, but you can also talk about Germany deciding to fight on two fronts, and you can talk about the UK being an island, and you can talk about the Battle of Britain in 1940, prohibiting the Germans from invading the UK, and you can talk about all these different things and decisions that are made. It's really easy to say, well, America won World War II. It's like, yeah, so there's something, the philosopher J.L. Mackie talks about Innes conditions, and one of the best examples of these, where you have necessary but insufficient causal variables, which is say, well, it was necessary that this happened, but it wasn't sufficient on its own. So, for example, think of a fire in a house. You hopefully this is useful, but think of a fire in a house that started, that takes place because the gas is left on. Someone comes home and switches the light on, and the spark makes the gas, and the windows are all closed and the doors were closed. So, what caused the fire? Well, was it the switching on a light? Well, no, because you needed the gas to be switched on, but you needed the doors and windows to be closed, and you needed, gas, and you needed. So, what caused the fire? Well, actually, all of those things together caused the fire. So you take that and apply it to World War II. What caused the eventual outcome of World War II? Well, basically all the universe going back in each stage before that to get to that point. Just saying the US won World War II is to say the gas being left on caused the fire. Well, no. It was necessary, but it was not sufficient. And so sorry to do a bit, I'm not sorry to do a bit of philosophy, but actually, so when you look at someone like Donald Trump here, he's just so simplistic. I would never say anything like this. It's just really, really overly simplistic.
I said, wow, isn't that amazing? We're the only one that wasn't celebrating, and we're the one that won the war. Now, Russia did help. They did lose 51 million people and all.
And then he says, well, actually, let's recognize that Russia played a part because this was a war fought on two fronts. But then he goes, what, 51 million? No, 26 million people died. I mean, there are different estimates for that, but I always say it's 26 million people died in that war. So A, you're making up numbers again, you're inflating stuff. But B, I don't know whether this is actually an example of you trying to give Russia props at every conceivable opportunity rather than Europe. It's like, well, it's almost like Europe didn't exist. Europe played no part. The British played no part. Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, Indians. In fact, you look at the Battle of Britain and pilots. We had Czech pilots and all sorts. So you know, all of these people are relevant. It was the US and it was Russia. And it's almost like that is what's going on now with this age of empires, where he sees Europe as somewhere to be carved up between the US and Russia. And it kind of fits in with that. It's just, wow.
In fairness, people would say, oh, he's sticking up for Russia. No, they lost 51 million people.
No, they didn't. But they lost a hell of a lot. And they were absolutely crucial. In fact, the Russians will say they won World War II. But of course, it's all everyone involved in there. You know, if it wasn't for the UK having held out to the Germans, then the Americans wouldn't have been able to do a D-Day landing from the UK. You know, all of these things contribute to an Allied victory in the end.
You know, can't forget that. But France was celebrating. And as you know, Hitler made a speech at the Eiffel Tower. But
no, he didn't.
I spoke to President Macron. He said, oh, we are celebrating the great victory of World War II. And I think that's great that he was doing it. But we're the one that won it, and we weren't celebrating. I said to myself, you know, isn't that crazy? And I think it's time for us to celebrate a little bit. You know, we've had a lot of victories. We won 2 world wars, and then we go out and change the name of the forts where we won the war.
We won 2 world wars. So the Americans won 2 world wars. Hitler made a speech at Eiffel Tower. No, he didn't. 51 million Russians died as well, so they helped a little bit. No, they didn't. 26 million odd Russians, of which, I don't know, 9 million or something were soldiers, military, and so on and so forth. You know, it's lies, and it's a bastardization of the truth. There will be elements of this involved. Like the Americans were super, super important for the outcome of World War II, and indeed to a degree in World War I. But like you got to know the amount of French and British soldiers. But French, I remember watching All Quiet on the Eastern Front, and and this was only relatively recently. It's just a couple of years ago, and when it came out, the new film version of it, and you learn history through the lens of your own country and your own biases. So my idea of like World War One is just like, well, it was all about the British fighting in the trenches, to the exclusion of recognizing, knowing that the freaking huge numbers of French people doing exactly the same as the British people, and it was just as much. It was in France, and it was their war as much as it was ours, and etc. etc. And like watching All Quiet on the Western Front, which was between the French and the Germans there, and nothing to do with the British, maybe go, oh yeah, it wasn't just about us. It's not just about us. And that's that kind of realization we all need. Like Donald Trump here, it's not just about us. It's not just about the US. It wasn't the US that won World War One and won World War Two. It was a confluence of all sorts of events and activities and desires and so on and so forth.
Or she got, we win world wars from Fort Robert E. Lee, from Fort Bragg, from all the different forts. And what do? We change the name of the forts because
who gives a toss about, like, I mean, I do care about the names of the forts actually, but what I'm saying is that his idea that they used to be this name, and therefore, you know, and we won World War II, therefore, and World War One, and we fought from these places when they were that name, therefore we can't change the names. It's just nonsense.
We want to be politically correct. So a lot of them were changing back. You probably noticed Fort Bragg.
Yay, Confederacy. Yay, advocacy for slavery. Yay, well done.
Others. But I think it's a time to celebrate our military. You know, we've rebuilt our military largely. Little low on ammunition.
So anyway, so on and so forth. That's Trump just trying to give the Russians some props there, but over-egging it and then getting his facts wrong and not understanding causality. Anyway, the US accuses a Russian of laundering millions and helping Moscow obtain sensitive technology. US prosecutors have charged cryptocurrency entrepreneur Yuri Gunin with laundering over $500 million in and helping sanctioned Russian entities bypass export controls. Between June 23 and January 2025, Gunin used his company to facilitate the movement of approximately $530 million through the US financial system. Hopefully that loophole has been closed. That guy has been Now, it's interesting that some Ukrainians are saying things like this. Ukrainians feel better now with the certainty that the US has abandoned us. We can now move on from your traps, slurs, maneuvers, and posturing. Now I'm waiting for the controlling partner reply, i.e., you would be nothing without us, etc., etc. So some Ukrainians, I think, are like, and some Europeans are like, we need to move past the US. It feels better now that we definitely know they're not going to help. Now we know you're on the other side. At least we know where we are, type thing. So I thought there's an interesting viewpoint there. Now, absolutely shocking that since a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, 76% of all Russian LNG exports have been carried on UK-owned or insured vessels. And this bloody trade financing Russia's war of terrorism against Ukraine must stop. The UK government must act now. So it's not something I was aware of, but this is definitely a problem. So the UK government needs to get onto that. Now, talking about the UK government, they have done a deal with Kazakhstan. They've approved a plan for military cooperation. I don't think it's that big. It's just going to be mainly like training and English training in the UK at institutions in the UK. Kazakhstan and the UK have approved a plan for military cooperation. Kazakhstan and the UK have agreed that for 2025 to 26, the corresponding document was signed in London following the visit of a Kazakh delegation led by the head of the Defense Department apparatus, Colonel Abola Kurmabalkuli, the government of the Republic reports. Now, this is going to be, I wonder if we have anything else on that. This is basically going to be I think the UK are putting 50 million, it's peanuts, absolute peanuts, 50 million pounds into that kind of neck of the woods and influence operations. We've seen France in Armenia and supporting Armenia in the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. You have China all over the place there. So China is having huge successful influence operations in that neck of the woods. You've got a lot of hydrocarbons. You've got a lot of land there that could be quite useful for one reason or another, and transportation and infrastructure. China, as ever, is involved. Belt and Road Initiative and all that kind of stuff. And I think the West are behind a curve on influence operations there. I was listening to the Rest is Politics doing a whole bit on China. I almost shared that with you. It's so good recently. And I think there's a complete naivety from the West, particularly in that kind of neck of the woods. And so this could be a very small and insignificant, if you like, attempt to redress a balance there from the UK. But it has wound up the Russians. So Russian Z bloggers are fuming over Kazakhstan's betrayal after it signed a 2025 to 2026 military cooperation plan with the UK. Kazakh troops will train in British military schools, learn English and prepare for peacekeeping missions. This despite Kazakhstan's membership of the Russia-led CSTO. So there you go. They are, and you can look at people getting angry with that and whatnot. So yeah, there is that. The Netherlands orders 1,000 Ukraine war refugees to leave in 4 weeks. Students, workers and other non-EU citizens who escaped Russia's war zone in the Netherlands face a September deadline to leave the country, ending their temporary protection that began in 2022. That's according to Euromaidan Press. The Elysee Palace, so France has announced that the President of the Republic, so Emmanuel Macron, will make an official visit to Greenland on the 15th of June to strengthen cooperation with this autonomous Danish territory, with Donald Trump having expressed interest in acquiring it previously. Macron will travel there at the invitation of the Greenland's Prime Minister, Jens Frederik Nielsen, and Denmark's Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, whom he will meet jointly. The Elysee Palace stated in a press release. Emmanuel Macron will then attend the G7 summit in Canada and will be the first foreign head of state to visit Greenland since Trump threatened annexation. The three leaders are expected to discuss security in the North Atlantic and the Arctic, as well as climate change, the energy transition, and the security of supply of critical minerals. The deep sea areas are not for sale, and no more than Greenland, Antarctica, or international waters are for sale, said Emmanuel Macron. So this is interesting positioning and against kind of that American imperialism. Interesting that Macron is doing that. Maybe a little poke in the eye of the Americans there. I don't know. There's been this, I've mentioned it several times, this meeting, this forum in Moscow, where you've had Errol Musk, George Galloway. Who else have you had? Dimitri Simes. You've had Jeffrey Sachs and Alex Jones, a whole bunch of wingnuts, just showing how in the Russian sphere of influence they really are. Quite a list of characters, and it's Alexander Dugin is one of the main organisers, who is, genocide advocating ultra-nationalist philosopher, with his kill, kill, kill speech linked there. And other people, it's a real who's who of other names on the list speak for themselves. I'm not doing a thread, said Serena Zabriskie. I'm interviewing her on Thursday. I'm not doing a thread on Alex Jones. Russian MFA head Sergei Lavrov is a cherry on top. Too bad it's not Putin himself. And I just love this. What a lineup of pure scum, says Jonathan Fink. And it is just absolute shills for Russia there. So if you're someone that thinks Jeffrey Sachs is still to be taken seriously, I mean, this is who he's hanging out with Errol Musk here, waxing lyrical about. So I showed you previously where he was saying that Moscow is the center of the world and it's an amazing city and more people should go there and it's wonderful, and it's the best city on earth. So there's Errol Musk just spouting absolute BS about his son and Trump, but basically calling the Russians some of the smartest people in the world and saying how wonderful Moscow is. So that's nice. And Alex Jones was one of the people that was there as well. Now, if you want to go and see Drew Pavlou, who is an Australian who is really pro-Ukraine, he's been out in Ukraine, had a public debate on, an online debate with Alex Jones. You can go and watch that. I was going to play you some of this, but I'll let you go and check that out. In our debate today, Alex Jones refused to condemn Russia for the mass kidnap and deportation of tens of thousands of Ukrainian children. Instead, he started ranting about LGBT Democrat child trafficking. I don't think he can condemn a single thing Russia does. And that's pretty much the same with all these people, whether it be Errol Musk and Elon Musk. Actually, he's never condemned anything Russia's done. Donald Trump has barely ever done that. These are all peas in the same pod. So well done, Drew Pavlou, for taking that head on and taking this disinformation to task. Anyway, that's enough from me. Take care. I'll speak to you soon. Really appreciate your support. I know there'll only be about 4 people still watching this, but if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe.